A number of MPs have been studying systemic racism in policing in Canada. The House of Commons Public Safety Committee launched the study in the wake of George Floyd's death in the United States and subsequent incidents here in Canada. Recently, the committee heard from RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, who at first struggled to admit systemic racism exists within that police force. Today, two chiefs of police appeared before the committee. We've reached one of them, Ottawa's Police Chief Peter Sloly. Hi, Chief Sloly. Great pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thank you very much, Vashi.
I watched your testimony before committee today with a lot of interest, and I have so many various things to ask you about based on what you said. But I wanted to start off actually where you did, and that was the idea, or by establishing the idea that systemic racism exists in society and in policing. And you also said that not addressing it fails communities and puts officers at risk. Can you expand on that a bit for us?
Yeah, and it's not an idea, it's a reality. And I come from that in my own lived experience in 53 years on this planet, 3 different careers, and in 2 different police services, as well as international work. It's a function of the human condition. We're great and wonderful creatures, but we're broken in some ways. And when you put us together in an organization and you try to develop systems that serve very complex communities and complex issues, inevitably, they're going to have unintended outcomes, even when the best effort goes into it. The impact in policing is often that communities are underserved, over-policed, and in some cases overrepresented in the justice system. When it comes to police officers, we overexpose them to risk, we undersupport them, and then we misrepresent their efforts, unfortunately, in the broader dialogue. And I think we just need to fix this. We need to own the fact that systemic racism and all systemic forms of discrimination exist in society, our institutions, and in the Ottawa Police Service. We need to own that we need to do better for our frontline officers and the communities that they serve, particularly the most marginalized, disenfranchised, and often racialized communities.
You also said, and this is something that in particular struck me because in so many of the conversations that I've had on this show in the past number of months, certainly those who push back against the term say often, we're not all racist, not everyone is racist. And you made a good point, I thought, or an interesting one, that in whatever context it doesn't mean that there are a few bad apples who are doing racist things, but even good people can consciously or unconsciously enable systems to perpetuate policies that work to the advantage of some as opposed to others. How does that apply in policing?
I've been part of this institution for almost 30 years now, and I can tell you I've done my very best to be a good human being and a good police officer and a good public servant. But I have, not by intent, been part of designing and implementing and evaluating systems that had disproportionate impacts, in some cases good on some groups and in some cases negative on other groups. But by admitting the fact that there's systemic racism, it doesn't mean that Peter Sloly himself is a racist, and that every member of every organization that I've worked in policing are all racist themselves, or misogynistic, or homophobic, as the case may be. It's a reality. We are imperfect people. We have imperfect organizations. We create imperfect systems. It's the systems that create the disproportionality. It's the systems that create the advantage or disadvantage. The responsibility on the Peter Slolys of the world is to recognize that is a failing and a weakness, to regularly evaluate it, and not just internally, but bring in academics and community. And when you see the problems that are there, do your very best to correct course. And I think, unfortunately, for too many people, the fear of admitting individual racism, systemic racism, has meant that we haven't owned the issue. Therefore, we haven't assessed the issue, and therefore we can't address the issue.
Do you feel like this is at all different, given all your experience, as you mentioned, over the last 3 decades? Even the study that the committee is doing right now, it's not the first time a body on Parliament has studied whether or not systemic racism exists in certain factions of society and to what degree. Do you think this will produce any kind of change that is different than the past?
Proof's always in the pudding, Vashi. I'm a glass is half full, and I believe it's going to be different. But here's what is different. I have never in my 30 years in policing and in all my time in Canada heard police leaders, political leaders, community leaders, police union leaders like Tom Stamatakis so clearly and directly articulate this issue. It exists. We're not denying it. We need to change. We're not resisting it. We need to change significantly, and this is a burning platform, and we need to take advantage of this crisis to do something differently. Chief Dale McPhee, who self-identifies as Métis, Peter Sloly, who self-identifies as Black, and Tom Stamatakis, representing the Canadian Police Association, the largest association representing frontline members, all said essentially the same thing today. It exists. We need to deal with it. We need to do this differently. We need to support our communities and our police officers better than we've ever done before.
This is a political show, and so I have two questions based on the role of government in all this. And the first is around a conversation you addressed in committee, but I know that one that you're very aware of at this moment, and that is the idea of defunding or taking away funds from the police. You argued that instead of doing that, what would be more effective is adding funds to areas like social services and housing and things that affect people's mental health. Can you present for our audience the argument for that rather than taking, I mean, the concern that I should establish for our viewers is that by funding the police to the degree that it does and expecting them to answer all those types of calls, money is not being properly allocated to the kinds of social services that might better address them.
Yeah, so let me come in from a financial standpoint. The vast majority of the people that are in the criminal justice system are in there because of mental health and addictions reasons. We are the 100% entry funnel for all the people, the police. We recognize that. The stats are clear. The analysis and evidence-based research is demonstrable across this country from coast to coast to coast. The majority of the people in the criminal justice system should not be there. So we've been overusing the justice system to address a wide range of social issues. And that's put a huge stress on the frontline officers. It does not solve the problems of the individuals who find themselves on the wrong side of a legal problem. And it doesn't help the communities that are most impacted by the disproportionality. The definition of insanity is to continue to do that. There's a lot of money in the system. We don't need more money. We need to spend the money smarter. Now, we still need to maintain funding to the police, but get them to do things differently. And I will tell you, the generation of police leaders that I'm a part of know that we need to do something differently and are willing to do that, including our union leaders like Tom Stamatakis. We know that we need to work more closely with public health, public education, public housing, the not-for-profit sector, so that when a call comes into a 911 dispatch center in a small, medium, or large-sized town in this country, that we can triage the call and know whether or not it's a social services call, a mental health call, an addictions call, or a police call, and then we can dispatch the right combination of services on a 365, 24/7 basis. It's not my opinion, but in the countries that have done this effectively well, places like Scotland, they didn't defund the police. They upfunded all the other areas, and then they integrated that service delivery model. So when I speak to academics who've studied the effect and impact of those efforts in other countries, they all said the same thing. Peter, don't let them defund you. But you need to use the funds you have differently to achieve different outcomes. And then you need to combine your efforts within that larger ecosystem of social service agencies, and they need to be funded properly. You need to share information. You need proper legislation like the Community Safety and Wellbeing legislation here in Ontario. You need privacy legislation to support information sharing. And then you need to have joint outcomes around which you're measured for performance. None of those things exist in Canada, but they exist as examples in other places. And it's for us to customize those examples to our Canadian context. But we can't do this by being emotional and demanding in a punish the police by taking their stuff and giving it over here. We did that with the mental health institution in the 50s and 60s. We defunded those institutions. We didn't fund the community properly, and we didn't enable the police services to be what they have been for 30, 40, and 50 years, the catch-all at 3 o'clock in the morning across this country for people in mental health crisis. That's not fair to the community. It's not fair to our cops.
You mentioned Scotland during your testimony. You also mentioned Portugal. I think you said you had visited there twice. The example of Portugal came up because there is renewed pressure, I would say probably or characterize on the federal government to look at decriminalization for simple possession. It's something that the chiefs of police in collaboration have come forward with. You put forward, I thought, a very interesting argument around clemency as well and who it would help and in what way. Could you do that for our audience right now?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to recognize I'm here representing the Ottawa Police Service. I have great respect for the Canadian Associate Chiefs of Police. I support the decriminalization strategy that they've announced. And I've spoken with Chief Adam Palmer, who's our president, and he has my full support on advancing that. And that's why I used the platform today. But the clemency piece was as important in the discussion. When we legalized cannabis a couple of years ago, I know there was a very big push, particularly within the Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, that as we legalize one thing, we need to recognize that we need clemency for those who got caught up in that system. We all recognize, well, let me be careful, I recognize, and a large number of police chiefs recognize that the war on drugs was a failure. Decriminalization and a health approach is something that we must invest in. But then we have to clear up some of the mistakes that we made in the past. And there are people who could be gainfully employed, who could travel internationally, who could get a job and pay taxes and contribute to society, build their family, build their personal equity. That could be a major force multiplier, an exponential wealth generator for private individuals, mostly from racialized communities. It could increase our tax base that could go to fund the things that we've just been talking about.
Okay, I'm out of time. Unfortunately, I have so many questions for you. I appreciate your time, Chief Sloly, very much.
Thank you so much, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.